They do that in the series is actually quite good. It's filled with sex. And it's filled with people's limbs being chopped off. I mean, it's one of the most, it's HBO, right? It's one of the most, it's not quite Showtime, but it is HBO. It's, because Spartacus is a train wreck on Showtime. That's just awful. That's just porn. But Rome on HBO was actually very, very carefully made. It's filled with violence and sex, but the way they portray Roman society and culture, not the history, not the plot. The plot line is not true to the history of Rome at all. It's about Caesar in that time period. But the way they do Roman society is very good. And there's a great scene in which one of the major female characters inscribes a curse on a lead sheet and rolls it up and sticks it in the cracks of the building of the woman she's cursing. And those are actually found archaeologically a lot because they're deliberately being hidden and they're metal, and so they survive. Yes?
Have you ever seen examples of or heard of skin with tattoos being found as tokens of somebody?
When?
My great-great-great-grandfather in his cabinet, we have skins that were found, and they were in glass plates. There's tattoos. They're tattoos.
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me. I mean, there are other worse things that were taken as
But I don't know if it's still like a token. Would it still be considered like a token from an Indian from the white man, or could it be hurting like that?
Oh yeah. I mean, what do you mean, a token from the Indian to the white man?
Like if the Indian killing, like taking that off the body.
I mean, whether an Indian might have done that is probably highly unlikely.
Okay.
Because for Indians, it was a cultural form that was really deeply focused on the scalp. Occasionally heads. The Europeans were much more about head taking than the Indians were. For example, the English in Ireland very rapidly adopted Irish practice of head taking as a trophy. So the English in 16th century Ireland were taking heads all the time. And there also you're seeing a mixed up understanding of, because for the Irish it was a cultural thing, for the English it was a profit thing. But it was also a profit thing mixed up with judicial understandings, whereas for the Irish it was all about more or less equivalent of scalp.
There just could be preservation or something.
Well, it could be, but I mean, whites did not focus on the scalp. Whites, like the leggings turned into boots, they would take varieties of body parts and turn them into trophies of various kinds. I mean, and that's true all the way through the present. I mean, this still happens. People don't like to talk about it, but it still happens, and it's widely documented for Vietnam, and it's currently documented for the word rocket.
I'm not absolutely positive on the facts, but is it true that I believe it was William Wallace's sword, the leather on the handle was made from skin, someone's skin? That's what the professor in Scotland when we visited said.
It's entirely possible. I mean, again, the point is not, there's 2 points there. One is that we're horrified, and we should be, because we don't want to accept that sort of behavior in our current moral understanding of the universe in its proper order, right? We don't want to celebrate or accept that sort of behavior. On the other hand, it's important to recognize the cultural context in which these things took place, right? That these were done for spiritually powerful reasons. They were not pure atrocities. Now again, some skin the leggings of the Indians for boots. That is not being done for spiritual reasons. In fact, that's part of my point of my discussion, is to say that there's a shift taking place here where the objects of death are changing in their meanings and their implications, especially objects of death associated with killing and atrocity. But you know, to say that could have happened in 12th century Scotland, absolutely. But I don't know. I might check into that.
He said that he was skinned from like his head to his heels, and the skin was wrapped.
Entirely possible. I've heard worse. I mean, seriously, the Assyrian kings, when they took a city in rebellion, they talk about this. They flayed half the population and draped their skins on the walls. Right? They cover the walls of the fortress with the skins of their enemies in the 9th and 7th centuries BC. And to make a statement, that's not spiritual, that's be scared of us. Thank you very much. Because the next people who do this, you know, don't want to actually do this. This is what happens to you. Yeah.
So if death used to be honored and then these things have
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm tracking.
It was honored and like remember death, and then people started.
Well, it's not that death was honored. I mean, it was and it wasn't. It depends on who you're asking and when you're saying. For example, part of what I was saying about what Europeans were thinking about the objects of death in the 18th century was that these objects related to their understanding of what was going to happen to them when they died. It's not that they honored death. It's that they understood the act of death as being a stage in a longer life or in the next life. And that what happened to you in the next life is related to the way that you die and the way that your body is treated. It's not about honoring death. It's about an understanding of what it means for the second life. Other questions?
Kind of to like, I guess, Adam Kirkland, what would be, I guess a good way of symbolizing death nowadays is the Day of the Dead.
Right.
So, I mean, there are still cases today where.
You mean it's sort of in the sense that it's a celebratory, positive thing.
Right.
Right. I mean, think about the difference. I mean, think about the meaning, the sort of cultural intention of the object of death, the skull, on the Day of the Dead, versus the versions that I was giving you. That's part of the other point. Of the objects look the same, but their meanings have transformed enormously. The meanings have transformed enormously. And you have the skull ring. You know who wears skull rings now the most? Because they're very popular. Bikers. Right? I mean, bikers, it's a huge... You know why I know that? Because I was Googling images of skull rings from the 18th century, and the vast majority of the results are for sale for bikers. Right? Because modern skull rings are for sale. So there's a whole... And that's partly started by Keith Richards. Because Keith Richards famously wore a skull ring, and you see him playing his guitar with a skull ring in his hand. So that's a picture people see a lot of back in the 60s and 70s. And weirdly enough, still, since he's still with us, amazingly enough. And so that sort of popularized that in the present. But again, the meaning of the object has changed enormously. Yes?
Okay. About the dream catchers, do you think that the manufacturers of dream catchers know the history behind them?
No, I have no idea. I have no idea. No one, it's funny, no one knows this until I mean, every class that I teach on warfare, at some point when I went to Native Americans, I'll bring up the whole dream catcher thing, and people are like, holy crap, I gotta get rid of that. I mean, I get that all the time. And it's something that just hit me one day. I was looking at a dream catcher, I was probably at the Grand Canyon, and there's like thousands of dream catchers for sale in the Grand Canyon gift store. And I'm looking and going, oh, that's what those are. I mean, because it just hit me all at once. That's what, and as soon as you look at it, you realize that's what it is. That's just so obvious.
So where does the idea that they take away bad dreams come from?
Again, it's about spiritual power, right? The idea, the scalp hoop had spiritual power, right? And so that piece of it lingers, that belief that it has spiritual power lingers. We just shift it into something that's a little friendly. And, catching bad dreams is a friendly version of spiritual power. It's important to recognize, and this is true, part of my story about the cursed skull was to suggest that Europeans are not that far from Indians about this, but Indians believe, Native Americans believe, that the spiritual world and the material world were in constant contact with each other. And that one could be used to influence the other. Both could be used to influence the either, right? And the trick was, how do you do that? And certain people had better capabilities for doing that. That's what a shaman is, right? A shaman is someone with access, more regular access to the spiritual, right? And so everything that you hear about, like the dreams, the spirit guides, I mean, all of those things were simply mechanisms to tap this reservoir, this other universe that is existing in parallel with yours at the same time, and get power and information from that side to bring onto this side. And that's not that different from the way Europeans think about it. The only difference is that Europeans imposed on top of that set of beliefs an idea about a hierarchical kind of God that the Indians didn't have in the same way. Yeah.
And dissecting was so, I don't know the word for it,
Scary.
yes, and looked down upon.
Yeah.
When did it become the norm as it is today?
That's when it was becoming the norm, in the 18th century. That's the beginning of modern study of cadavers, and that's why it was generating this reaction. Because you literally had professional grave. In fact, have you seen The Christmas Carol? I mean, the long version where there's a scene where what's his his name? Not Jacob Marley, but Scrooge. Scrooge. Thank you. Sometimes your brain just locks up. Where Scrooge is dead and he sees people who are taking away his bedclothes. They come into his house because they found out that he's dead and they're stealing all of his stuff. Well, that was really a hint. That was that was intended to make you think of grave robbers, right? Because the odds that they would actually get into his house and take his stuff just because he's gone is low. But the odds that they could go to a freshly dug grave and take the body and sell it to a medical college is very high. So the whole issue of grave robbers was a major cultural phenomenon in the 18th and early 19th century. It was all related to this issue of whether the grave robbers would be selling your body to the medical school. And that's illegal. The legal version was the one that occurred at the hanging site. Those guys were given license to take the bodies by the state.
So, is the cesarean section, is that true that Caesar wanted to see what he, so,
No, he was born that way.
okay, so.
But that's totally different, because
But
that's an option of life.
That's far before.
Yeah, but I mean, that's not dissection. That's cesarean section is opening the belly to take the baby out so that it lives. That's not a dissection.
It just seems like you need to know that anatomy and do the dissection.
Oh, well, the Greeks and the Romans knew their anatomy much better than early modern Europeans did, because they didn't have the same hang-ups about the second coming. And so they actually conducted dissection in the ancient world, but their records and the drawings and things like that didn't survive. But they actually conducted dissection.
Okay.
And the Europeans were relearning it.
And which Caesar was that?
Julius.
You were talking about during the Victorian age, the shift of human mortality and death, it kind of shifted to not being so dark.
Right.
Is the Enlightenment period kind of responsible for that shift?
Yeah, you could put it that way. I mean, it's usually connected more to Romanticism, the Romantic period. So the early 19th century Romanticism is what, you know, the adjective that's used for the skull ring is Gothic. The adjective that's used for the weeping willow and urn is Romantic. So it's a shift from the Gothic to the Romantic that occurs in the Victorian period. And of course, it's a long shift. I mean, it takes time for this to happen. And it depends on where you are as to when it's happening. But that's the real shift. The Enlightenment is playing into that, but it's just pinging around the edges. It's a much broader cultural phenomenon, I think.
Looking into sources like those diaries, how would you describe the difference between soldiers' viewpoint of their own death or of the death of the people that they're fighting with, as opposed to the death of the people they're fighting against?
That's a great question. I mean, in essence, that's the kind of question I'm trying to answer, because they don't say things like that. I mean, they almost don't say things like that in the 19th century, much less in the 18th century, when they're much more laconic. And so that's part of the project that this is about, is to try to see what do these guys think about death, and how does that thought process affect what they do. You know, so for example, again, I don't think I've got this locked up, but you know, one theory is I'm scalping this Indian because I want him to be dismembered in the next world. Right? It's not just about revenge, it's about what he would do to me and therefore I'm going to do to him. Not that I think he's going to be in heaven, right? But he could be in hell, dismembered, right? I mean, that's famously, you guys know the image from the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo's painting behind the wall, not the one on the roof, the one where the flayed saint, the face is, you guys ever had art history class, and they show you Michelangelo's face is in the skin of the flayed saint. There's a figure holding the flayed skin, and that's the people going to hell. And they're going to hell in that condition. So the saint is in the condition of his body as he goes into the next life. And that's part of the European belief system. Now again, theologically speaking, the church was not teaching that. But the church did not teach that you went into the next life dismembered and had to live that way. But that was part of the popular cultural understanding of what would happen.
Do you think there's a connection between the Continental Army scalping the Indians and the Marines being on the bodies? Do you think there's
A direct connection? No. But is
I
it
mean,
similar?
sort of a revenge.
Yeah, no, I mean, here's the thing. We have a tendency to universalize human responses based on our understanding of modern psychology, right? And so I always tell my students in history classes that every generation, every society has its own set of colored glasses on when they look at the world. And we wear rose-colored glasses, and those guys were wearing blue-colored glasses 100 years ago. And for us to understand how they saw the world, we cannot assume it derives from a modern understanding of human psychology. And so, yeah, I think there are similar processes at work. I'm not saying that we're all different all the time, but I think there is a different meaning to those guys, those Marines, than there was to the Continentals. I think there is a different meaning. And if you ask me to pin it down and say exactly what is different, I'd have a hard time. Because to me, that's the whole enterprise of what I'm doing, trying to understand the previous era. I'm trying to get inside their heads, and it's really, really hard to do. And you can only get so far in. But I think it's different.
Do you think it's more connected because that's such a root in our DNA time, the war area? I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it does. I mean, this is a major
like
discussion amongst the sociobiologists about what is the role of evolutionary selection in determining human response to aggression, right? And that's a major, major subject about which I've written a lot. And so I believe there is a genetic component to certain aspects of our behavior. But I also, at the same time, believe there's very powerful cultural filters that are affecting the way we perceive what we see and the choices that we then make. And trying to figure out which one is sort of built in, hardwired, and which one is culturally sort of pushed, really tough to do. And that's why I think it's so much fun. There was someone in the back, yes.
So Indians like the originators of the whole scalping deal? Was it done beforehand? They kind of took it and they just put these memes out.
No, that's a good question. Because in fact, as a part of the new aging of Indians that occurred in the 60s and 70s, the thing that created dream catchers, people started pushing the idea that scalping was invented by Europeans and picked up by Indians. And that is demonstrably not true. Archaeologically, it's very easy to come up with lots of pre-Columbian scalping contexts in North America. In fact, they've even discovered a Siberian scalping incident, pre-Bering Strait crossing, right? So that you can even trace it back into Siberia. There's no question that it's a Native American cultural tradition. There's also no question that when European colonies start offering bounties for scalps, that Indians are amongst the people who will take advantage of those bounties. And so it will change what scalps mean to Indians as well, but they are doing it for cultural reasons at the outset.
So no other cultures did it for like their own cultural reasons?
No, you'll find other cultures that do it in South America and in Pacific islands, but what's much more common is head taking. Just take the whole head and curate the head. I know that sounds like a fairly banal word to use for what you do to a head, but curate is a technical term for preserve in some way or other.
Okay, you said something about, I don't remember, I'm not a history major, but something about a whole bunch of people, I don't know if it's Europeans. Anyways, they chop off their heads, a whole bunch of people. What do they do with them all? Like their skulls and stuff.
You mean the Irish?
I don't know if it was Irish or...
Well, it depends. I mean, the Assyrians,
What do they do with them
I
all?
talked about the Assyrians skinning folks, but the Assyrians also chop off their heads. They made a big pyramid out of their skulls, as sort of to say, this is what happens to you if you rebel.
Is that what archaeologists find? They find big, massive pyramids?
Occasionally, yeah. That's not a happy day, because there's all sorts of laws that get involved. But no, it depends on the society, right? If you are chopping off heads in order to prove that you killed a certain person. So, for example, in the 16th century, the English were fighting in Ireland, and there'll be a bounty on somebody's, literally, head. You bring the head back. Just hold him by the hair in front of the judge and say, here he is. Yeah. And then you throw it away. Or, sort of famously, in England, the heads of people who've been executed, where do they go? Anybody know? On spikes. Where?
At the gates.
To the tops of bridges, so that everybody sees them when they go across the bridges, right? And they just rot in place and fall off and go into the river and wash away. If you're taking the head as a trophy, not for some legalistic punishment exemplary purpose, you're taking the head as a trophy, then you curate it and you keep it, you save it. Right? That's the difference between a curated skull and an uncurated skull. One gets put on a pike and just rots away, and the other one gets saved. And those we found. Not me. I haven't excavated any skulls that have been curated. Heaven help me, I hope I never do. Because it's very complicated. Way too many laws get involved. We found the skull this summer that was not curated, it was just buried, it was a normal burial, and all the bureaucratic entanglements that generated are really scary to describe. Anything else? Well, I hope that was fun. Thank you.